One of the many sad signs of our times is that people are not only playing the race card,
Okay, so he seems to be implying that only Democrats play the race card, but Republicans, their whole platform is based on racism.
they are playing the slavery card, which is supposedly the biggest trump of all. At the so-called Million Man March in Washington, poet Maya Angelou rang all the changes on slavery, at a rally billed as forward-looking and as being about black independence rather than white guilt. Meanwhile, best-selling author Dinesh D'Souza was being denounced in the media for having said that slavery was not a racist institution.
Slavery was a racist institution, you liar.
First of all, anyone familiar with the history of slavery around the world knows that its origins go back thousands of years and that slaves and slave owners were very often of the same race. Those who are ignorant of all this, or who think of slavery in the United States as if it were the only slavery, go ballistic when anyone tells them that this institution was not based on race. Blacks were not enslaved because they were black, but because they were available at the time. Whites enslaved other whites in Europe for centuries before the first black slave was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Only late in history were human beings even capable of crossing an ocean to get millions of other human beings of a different race. In the thousands of years before that, not only did Europeans enslave other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other native peoples of the Western Hemisphere. D'Souza was right. Slavery was not about race.
It was in the U.S.
The fact that his critics are ignorant of history is their problem. What was peculiar about the American situation was not just that slaves and slave owners were of different races, but that slavery contradicted the whole philosophy of freedom on which the society was founded.
See, that's the thing about this guy. He's such a liar, he just contradicts himself in the same video.
If all men were created equal, as the Declaration of Independence said, then blacks had to be depicted as less than men. While the antebellum South produced a huge volume of apologetic literature trying to justify slavery on racist grounds, no such justification was considered necessary in vast reaches of the world and over vast expanses of time. In most parts of the world, people saw nothing wrong with slavery.
So as you can see there, he mentions that slavery was about racism, while at the same time saying it wasn't. The guy's full of crap.
Strange as that seems to us today, 100 years ago, only Western civilization saw anything wrong with slavery, and 200 years ago, only a minority in the West thought it was wrong. Of all the tragic facts about the history of slavery, the most astonishing to an American today is that, although slavery was a worldwide institution for thousands of years, nowhere in the world was slavery a controversial issue prior to the 18th century.
So if you need evidence as to how much of a liar this guy is, go to Wikipedia, look up timeline of abolition of slavery and serfdom, and you can see for yourself how full of crap this guy is.
People of every race and color were enslaved, and enslaved others. White people were still being bought and sold as slaves in the Ottoman Empire, decades after American blacks were freed. Everyone hated the idea of being a slave, but few had any qualms about enslaving others. Slavery was just not an issue, not even among intellectuals, much less among political leaders, until the 18th century, and then it was an issue only in Western civilization.
No, this guy's just a liar, and he thinks you're stupid. The fact is China, Japan, Korea, all kinds of countries, Western, non-Western, all kinds of times banned slavery. The guy's just a liar.
Among those who turned against slavery in the 18th century were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other American leaders. You could research all of 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. But who is singled out for scathing criticism today? American leaders of the 18th century.
And, this is the part that shows you what a bizarre liar Thomas Sowell is. There were founding fathers who were against slavery. For example, John Adams never owned slaves, but the guys he's presenting here, all of them owned slaves, and all of them owned slaves their entire lives. So, I don't know what he's talking about other than, the guy's just such a liar, that, maybe he gets some kind of kinky fetish, thrill out of it. I don't know.
Those who talk about slavery as if it were just the enslavement of blacks by whites ignore not only how widespread this institution was and how far back in history it went, they also ignore how recently slavery continued to exist outside of Western civilization. While slavery was destroyed in the West during the 19th century, the struggle to end slavery elsewhere continued well into the 20th century, and pockets of slavery still exist to this moment in Africa. But there is scarcely a peep about it from black leaders in America who thunder about slavery in the past. If slavery were the real issue, then slavery among flesh and blood human beings alive today would arouse far more outcry than past slavery among people who are long dead. The difference is that past slavery can be cashed in for political benefits today, while slavery in North Africa only distracts from these political goals.
I find it ironic that a guy who works at a think tank and basically lies for a living would say these things, but oh well. Never underestimate the hypocrisy, right?
Worse yet, talking about slavery in Africa would undermine the whole picture of unique white guilt, requiring unending reparations. While the Western world was just as guilty as other civilizations when it came to enslaving people for thousands of years, it was unique only in finally deciding that the whole institution was immoral and should be ended. But this conclusion was by no means universal even in the Western world, however obvious it may seem to us today.
I don't know why he keeps pushing this whole thing that the West is the only place that banned slavery. It's almost like his followers are too stupid to check facts.
Thousands of free blacks owned slaves in the antebellum South, and years after the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, whites as well as blacks were still being bought and sold as slaves in North Africa and the Middle East. Anyone who wants reparations based on history will have to gerrymander history very carefully. Otherwise, practically everybody would owe reparations to practically everybody else.
So here's the thing, I don't know how you do reparations, where pretty much everyone involved was dead. But, what we can do is we can start telling the truth about it. And, I'm calling out Thomas Sowell. Stop lying. Stop being an Uncle Tom.